everyone, welcome back to our RBT training. So today we're going to talk about task analysis and chaining. Remember last time we talked about shaping and the fact that that is taking some form of a behavior and reinforcing successive approximations until we get to an end target behavior, okay? Chaining is kind of similar to shaping in that we start off with one step and add multiple steps until we get to an end result. But with chaining, we don't have to initially have the behavior in their repertoire from which we build from, okay? Task analysis and chaining is the process of breaking down complex activities or tasks into smaller, more manageable teaching steps. So, let's write a SAFMED card for that. One side, our definition is going to be chaining. And on the back side, our definition is going to be the process of breaking down complex activities or tasks into smaller, more teachable steps. All right, so chaining is a way to teach a multi-step or complex skill. While often used as a component of ABA instruction, chaining can be used to teach anyone a complex skill. A complex skill is a skill that really consists of several small behaviors that are linked or chained together to accomplish a terminal or end goal, kind of similar like we talked about with shaping. An example of a skill consisting of several discrete behaviors is wiping a table, right? We think of a lot of the things that we do as just simple tasks, but really when we break it down, there are a whole bunch of small steps that go into that. And as we talked about with our children with autism, we really have to break down steps into smaller, more manageable pieces, sometimes teach them independently, and then put them all together into a chain and teach them all the way through as a whole analysis, a task analysis. And we can do that using a backward chain, a forward chain, or a total task chain, depending on the ability of our learner. Okay? But so the example with wiping a table, to you and I, it might seem simple. Hey, can you go clean off the table? There's a lot that goes into that behavior. That end goal of the table being wiped completely clean of nothing, squeaky clean, right? That takes someone going over and knowing where to access the cleaning materials, because the spray bottle might be under the counter and the paper towel or wipe or rag might be elsewhere. So knowing where to go to get those materials, and then the ability to come back to the table without getting distracted, right? And then what goes into the cleaning. So is it just like 1, 2, 3, all done? Or is it really thorough? Are we expecting them to clean the whole table so it's spotless? And then what are we expecting them to do with those things when they're done? Can they throw them away? Should they throw them away? Or can they leave them on the table and let someone else do it? So all of these things, kind of like shaping, we need to take into consideration. A lot of it has to do with our learner, and then also what our expectation is for their end goal, okay? So teaching a skill using chaining is commonly recommended if the child can only perform some of these steps, consistently misses or skips steps, or is completing steps incorrectly. So, for example, on a daily basis, the child throws their wet toothbrush in the sink instead of putting it in the toothbrush holder. That would be a good situation to introduce chaining into. Another issue I see commonly is a child who independently uses the bathroom and then consistently fails to button or zip their pants back up, right? You missed the last step. That is a child who could benefit from a chaining program. One example, a way I like to explain chaining is comparing it to cooking, right? I'm a recipe person. Even if I've made something multiple times, I still like to have the recipe in front of me. Imagine I asked you to make me some oatmeal raisin cookies, but I gave you no recipe to follow and no expectation of what exactly to do. You're like, oh my God, completely lost, especially, for our less than handy guys who might need explicit directions, right? What kind of raisins do I like? Do I need cinnamon? Do I need cookies, vanilla extract? Who knows? Do I prefer chewy or crispy cookies? You would likely start or finish the cooking chain successfully, but have errors or missteps in the middle. So this is why I use chaining to teach a skill, and why it can be so helpful, right? It gives definitive, discrete steps so that they're much less likely to make a mistake, ruining your cooking recipe or ruining the chaining procedure, okay? For a child with autism, hearing a demand like make your bed may not mean anything. They may need a recipe to follow, which clearly states the expectations of what we mean by make your bed. All right. So there are 3 different types of chaining. Like I said before, there's backward chaining, forward chaining, and then total task chaining. Depending on your learner, you're going to choose a different chaining procedure. Okay, we'll talk about a little bit more about that afterwards. But backwards chaining. Backward chaining refers to teaching a behavior chain beginning with the last step. You would completely prompt the entire chain of behaviors except the last step. Using the toothbrush example, the child would be prompted to do every single step and then would independently put the toothbrush in the toothbrush holder. So remember, we're going to go back to our hierarchy here, okay? That means that I would literally fully guide our individual through all of those steps until they reach that last step of putting the toothbrush in the toothbrush container, which would be natural or no guidance, okay? Independent. I would expect them to do that by themselves. So literally I would hand on hand over, helping them put it in their mouth, putting it under the sink, turning off the water, and then as soon as that's done, my hands come off, and I'm expecting them to do that independently. Put it into the container. That's it. Backward chaining is recommended if the child can successfully complete more steps at the end of the behavior chain. Backward chaining also has the advantage of creating a link between the most work and the biggest reinforcer. If I'm using backward chaining to teach a child to make French toast, then I would prompt every step and have the child independently use a spatula to move the toast from the pan to the plate. Then we get to eat, right? Everybody loves that. So the most work, the independent step, led to the biggest reinforcement, right? Consuming the food. Once the last step is mastered at an independent level, then move to the last second step, then the last to third step, etc., etc., etc. Okay? And obviously it doesn't have to be a natural reinforcer of being able to consume an edible if you're making French toast. But for example, if it was the one where we're talking about wiping the table, then maybe they earn a good job or a token in their token economy of some sort for doing the whole task completion. All right. But essentially, backward chaining also gives the individual more guidance. Okay, more errorless learning, because you're not letting them make any mistakes, and you're giving them tons and tons of prompting and help as they work through all of those initial steps, okay? So they're going to be able to have more modeling and more time with hand-over-hand guidance than letting them make error. So the idea is that by the time that they get to those first steps that are in the chain, that they've had help so many times that it's just going to be natural to them, and they're just going to be able to pick up and do it, okay? But obviously, for a learner that is more higher functioning, it's not ideal because they don't need help every single time through those last steps. They're going to breeze through it, okay? So you might want to use something more like forward chaining or a total task chaining. So I'm going to, before we go on to forward or total task, I'm going to pause for a second, and I want to give you an example of what a backward chain looks like. this is a backward chain. This will also be uploaded in your content area, so make sure that you download a copy of this so that you can see it and have it in front of you as we're talking about it. So let's look at our parts of our task analysis, our backward chain. So the target behavior, remember we need to figure out exactly what that is. Folding a napkin, definition or operational definition: when providing with a napkin and told fold the napkin, the student will take steps below to fold the napkin. Step 1, with both hands, pinches corners of napkin to closest to the student and folds the napkin in half. Step 2, with both hands, pinches left 2 corners of napkin and folds to the right. Then down here, we have our prompt hierarchy, kind of similar to our pyramid behind us. However, this only allows for 4 different prompt levels. We've got FP, which is full physical prompt, hand over hand, full guidance, right? So our full physical down there, or FMG. Then we have our partial prompt, which is touch at the elbow or shoulder to initiate response. And then gestural prompt, motioning for or toward the expected response, and then independent. So then below we've got some directions here. Lay out the napkin flat on the table, tell Charlotte, fold the napkin, start by manually guiding her to complete all of the steps. Repeat this 3 times, right? That's the initial step. So we do 1, 2, 3. Then by step 2, become a less intrusive prompt at gestural prompt. So we do this 1, 2, 3 times. This is going to be full prompt as we go through. Mark that for you. Let's say that we were starting that today. So I'm going to put our date, 7/11. Maybe I ran this trial 3 times in a row. Hopefully I had the opportunity to. That would be fantastic. So remember, my date goes up here. And then, what were my directions? Let's see. Okay, so I need to start by manually guiding her to complete all of the steps. So that's full guidance. So it should be FP and FP. And up here, if you can, it says date and prompt level. So you should write the expectation underneath the date. Our expectation is level 2 at FP. 2, FP. Okay, I don't know if you can see that. Oh, I have the step number and then the prompt level, which is full prompt, okay, for those 3 trials in a row. Then let's read our next step. So start by manually guiding her. Then step 2, become a less intrusive prompt at gestural prompt. So step number 2 now becomes a gestural prompt. Actually, I believe we have this incorrect on here because that should be, remember, our partial prompt comes way before gestural prompt. So I'm going to flip that right now, and we will say that we need to move on to a partial prompt next, because we go from full physical to partial, and gestural is way at the top, so this was written incorrectly. So let's say it's tomorrow. I'm going to write 7/12 on here. My next step is still step 2, but instead I'm using a partial prompt. And it should be the same for all 3. 2, partial prompt, 2, partial prompt. Okay, so now remember, for this first step, no matter what, you're still going to do a full prompt, right? The only time that you're now minimizing or using least to most is right here, because now this becomes, hopefully, a partial prompt. Okay? If they get it correct, we put a plus mark at partial prompt. But say the next one, all of a sudden they're distracted by something. Obviously, they're not going to have the opportunity to do an incorrect step 1, but for step number 2, they get distracted. It was supposed to be a partial prompt, but they needed a full prompt, so I'm going to put a minus, okay? And then instead, I would probably put FP instead of PP, so that the person knew that I ended up having to give them a full prompt instead of a partial prompt. But then I did it again, full prompt. My expectation is still for them to do a partial prompt, and they were able to do it, so I'm going to write PP and then plus. Awesome. Okay. All right, so that's just an example, and this continues on. So then the idea is that you start to see this get more independent as we go along, and then slowly these become more independent up here. All right, so we're offering always as much support as we can with those beginning steps and slowly fading off backward. So those last steps going up, okay? That's why it's a backward chain. All right, so please watch the video that has to do with backward chaining so that you see a full analysis and a full breakdown of someone actually engaging in the backward chaining procedure.